So in this talk, I will discuss what gives water color, to which colors are water bodies changing, with some data my colleagues and I analyzed for lakes across the continental US. And then also, why should we care? What do these changes in water color mean for ecosystem and human health? But before we get started, let's first ask the question, what gives something color? What gives anything color? And really, color is traced back to light, specifically light that we refer to as visible light. So remember that the sun is emitting radiation or energy at many different wavelengths, including short wavelength gamma rays up to longer wavelength radio waves. But when it comes to color, we're interested in this narrow band of light energy, sort of towards the middle here. And if we blow that up, we see the rainbow of colors to which we're familiar, with short wavelengths corresponding with violets and blues, and longer wavelengths corresponding to oranges and reds. And in fact, we call this the visible part of the solar spectrum because the human eye perceives this light energy as color. So between 400 and 700 nanometers, we see this energy as color. So how do we see color? Well, remember that the sun is emitting this visible light, and as it strikes the surface of an object on Earth, two things can happen. Those wavelengths of light can either be absorbed or they can be reflected. So as we're looking at visible light hitting the surface of this leaf here, we see that most of the wavelengths of the visible spectrum are being absorbed, except the green wavelengths are hitting the surface of the leaf and bouncing off. They're being reflected. And it's those wavelengths of light that are bouncing off that are available for our eyes to catch and see that color. So when we look at a leaf and see green, we are seeing green wavelengths of light that are bouncing off of that into our eyes. And we know that leaves and algae are green because they produce a pigment called chlorophyll, right? And actually, algae and plants make chlorophyll specifically so that they can catch light from the sun to power photosynthesis. And what I'm showing you here is something called an absorption spectrum. So on the x-axis of this graph, again, we have the visible spectrum from 400 to 700 nanometers. And on the y-axis, we have relative absorption. So either low absorption of those wavelengths or high absorption. And what you can see is that the absorption spectrum for chlorophyll is really high in the short wavelength violet and blues, as well as the longer wavelength oranges and reds. But absorption is very low in the greens. So again, we perceive algae and plants as green because there's less absorption of those wavelengths of light and more reflection bouncing off. So what about the color of water? Why, for example, is Crater Lake in Oregon this brilliant blue color? Well, the same processes are happening here as well. If we look at the interactions between light and water, it turns out that water molecules absorb those longer wavelengths, those reds, oranges, and into yellows, more so compared to shorter wavelength blues and violets. And so the reason that Crater Lake is so blue is because the blue wavelengths of light are going down deeper into the water column compared to those longer wavelengths of light. And in fact, what's happening is rather than being absorbed by water molecules, those blue wavelengths of light are actually bouncing off the water molecules, what we call scattering around. And the intensity of that scatter leads to and more blue color. So Crater Lake is actually pretty pure water. It has a very small watershed because it literally sits on top of the caldera of an extinct volcano. There's not a lot of vegetation, not a lot of soils, and so not a lot of other materials run off into Crater Lake. Again, it's fed mostly by rainwater, so it's pretty pure water. But as we start to add other things to bodies of water, they begin to change color. For example, as we add nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, think of this as fertilizer, to the system, we begin to shift the color from blue to green, because as we add nutrients, this promotes the growth of algae, which we just learned why algae are green. And so the more algae that we have in the system, the more green the water gets. But we can also have additions of organic matter to the system. So organic matter is coming from the degradation of terrestrial or land plants. So as these plants begin to decompose and form soils, that organic matter can leach off the land into a nearby body of water. The analogy that I often talk of is like a tea bag, right? The longer you leave your tea bag steeping in your hot cup of tea, the darker that water is going to get, the darker brown it will get. So the more organic matter we add, the browner the water. I want to emphasize that inland and coastal waters may naturally exist in any one of these colors, from blue to green to brown. It's not like blue lakes are healthier than brown lakes. Brown lakes that occur in places with lots of wetlands with rich organic soils are perfectly healthy. They should be brown in color. And you might also have a system that's naturally green in color because it's the watershed or the land that's draining water to that system just naturally has more nutrients within it. So again, it's important to recognize that not one color is necessarily better than the other, that they can naturally exist in any one of these states. But the problem is that now what we're seeing is that systems, inland and coastal waters, that should be relatively more blue, like Crater Lake here, are beginning to change color. In some cases, they're shifting more to a green color because an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus is running off into those waters, promoting more and more algal growth. And again, we refer to that as eutrophication. So excess algae due to excess nutrients, eutrophication. Other systems are becoming browner in color because for some reason, the land is becoming leakier to organic matter. And so as more organic matter moves into the system, we get browner and browner color, which we refer to as brownification. But even more worrisome is that more recently, what we've noted is that some systems are receiving an excess of both, an excess of nutrients and organic matter. And right now, we just call these murky lakes, but maybe we should start introducing a new term, murkification. I don't know. We'll see how that pans out. So why is this happening? Well, there are a lot of us out there, right? So what we're seeing here is a satellite image of North and Central America at night, and each one of these white dots represents the human population. So there's lots of us, and we particularly like being near water. So the darker the white dot here, or the brighter the white dot, the more people. And so we love our coastlines, and we also love our rivers. And as more and more people move into watersheds and alter the landscape so that we can grow our crops, build cities, build our homes, build factories, we begin to change the characteristics of a watershed, and that can lead to increased inputs of nutrients, organic matter, or both. Sometimes these alterations to the watershed are so dramatic that we can see their effects from space. So what I'm showing you here is an image of a satellite image of the Great Lakes. And what we can see are some massive algal blooms that are occurring in Lake Michigan, parts of Lake Huron, and Lake Erie as well. So this is an algal bloom occurring that we can see from space, but we can also see brownification occurring from space. So here I'm showing you a satellite image from coastal North Carolina. This is Cape Lookout here. This is Beaufort and Morehead City. And what you can see is we have all these rivers, which are naturally brown, naturally blackwater rivers, that are draining an excessive amount of organic matter to our coastal waters of the Atlantic Ocean. So normally these rivers are very low flow systems, but this is taken right after Hurricane Florence in September of 2018. And what we're seeing is that as hurricanes become more frequent and more intense, we have these low-flowing rivers that normally trickle out a little organic matter at a time are now dumping much more of it into our coastal waters. And you can see it changing the color here from blue to browns. Okay, so eutrophication, it's caused by an increase in nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. Again, I don't want you to think that nitrogen and phosphorus are bad. Nitrogen and phosphorus are actually really important to supporting healthy food chains, aquatic food chains. We need nitrogen and phosphorus to build the basic building blocks of life, DNA, RNA, proteins, cell membranes. So we have to have some of it. But the problem is when it's introduced in excess, like we see here in this lake in the foreground compared to its neighbor, that's when algae starts to grow out of control and become a problem. So some problems, why we should care about this. Well, first of all, they're just not as nice aesthetically, right? I doubt any one of you would want to jump into this water that looks like pea soup. And so you could have a loss of recreation, right? A loss of swimming, boating, fishing, or maybe even a loss of revenue with people not wanting to buy homes near a lake that looks like pea soup compared to a more cleaner lake. More seriously, these algal blooms can be a public health concern. As you see on the right-hand side here, this is actually a sign saying, warning, harmful algal bloom or harmful algae present. This was actually at Lake Anna this past summer. And so not all of these blooms, but some of them are caused by algae that release toxins into the water. Toxins that can make us as humans sick, but also our pets and livestock. Sometimes the symptoms are as mild as a skin rash, but in other cases, you might have more serious damage to your liver, your nervous system, or sometimes, particularly in pets or livestock, it can result in death. So that's a major concern with these algal blooms. Environmentally, we worry because they can result in something that we refer to as a dead zone. So we lose oxygen as a consequence. As that algae begins to die and is decomposed by bacteria, that uses up the oxygen in the system. And so when you have low to no oxygen, that can lead to a fish kill. Like you see here, this poor catfish in an algal bloom in the waters near Toledo, Ohio. So eutrophication, not a good thing. Brownification is also a potential concern. Remember here, brownification is caused by an increase in the amount of dissolved organic matter running off the land into the water. Now, this brownification is an interesting, complex issue because in some respects, it could be a positive sign. So what do I mean by that? Well, prior to the Clean Air Act, acid rain was a big issue. And acid rain makes soils more acidic. And acidic soils hold on to organic matter more tightly than basic soils. So what was happening as soils were becoming acidic, holding on to organic matter, inland waters were becoming clearer, bluer in color, which to some was a welcome thing. Not that acid rain is a good thing, but it was kind of nice to live on these clear blue lakes. But now, with the passing of the Clean Air Act and other legislation to clean up our skies, acid rain has been dramatically reduced. And so soils are coming back to a more basic condition. And as a consequence of that, they're releasing more organic matter, and those lakes and rivers are becoming more brown again, which is the system transitioning back to its natural state. So in some cases, this browning is actually a good, healthy sign. But we also know that other systems are browning when maybe they not necessarily should be very brown in color. And we think, we're not certain, we're still doing research on this because this is just a phenomenon that we've been studying over the past few decades. But we think that it's related to changes in climate. So as temperature and precipitation patterns change, that can affect how much organic matter comes into the system. And also land use changes as we convert forests to agricultural fields or urbanized areas, that can also affect how much browning occurs. Why do we worry about browning? Well, aesthetically, it might not be pleasing to someone, but more concerning is if these brown waters are a source of drinking water, all that organic matter has to be removed before we can even begin to treat it for drinking water purposes. The reason why that is because when we treat water with chlorine or bromine, if there's any organic matter in the water, it reacts with those chemicals to form something that we call disinfection byproducts. And those byproducts are concerned because in some cases there's evidence that they may lead to cancer. They're carcinogenic. And so we want to make sure that we strip that water of all that organic matter before we treat it for drinking water purposes. Obviously, this takes more time and it costs more money to do so. One of the other health concerns is that as you add organic matter to the system, if there are heavy metals present, like mercury or arsenic, the organic matter actually interacts with these metals to make them what we refer to as being more mobile. They can pass up the food chain more easily. And so individuals have to be more concerned about consuming fish from those systems because they may be higher in metal content. In addition to that, environmentally, that organic matter, just like that dying algae, that brown color is kind of food for bacteria. Sorry about that. So as the bacteria chew on that organic matter, they take up the oxygen, and this could also potentially lead to dead zones, something that we're beginning to explore more. And then interestingly, green and brown lakes are also play a role in climate change. So green lakes actually take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So they're removing a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. That's because algae needs CO2 for photosynthesis, right? So they suck algae from the atmosphere into the water. But brown lakes, on the other hand, they burp it back out as all that bacteria chews on that organic matter. They make excess CO2 that leaves the water and goes back into the atmosphere. So as lakes become browner in color, there's more concern about their contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So these changes in water color have been an inspiration to mine and my students' research at Longwood. And one of the questions that I've been particularly interested in is thinking about our lakes across the United States. Are they changing color? And if so, what colors are more prevalent than others? And in 2018, my colleagues Amina Pollard with the US EPA and Stephanie LeBoux and Stephanie Hampton from Washington State University, we got together and tried to tackle this question. And we did so by using an awesome resource called the EPA's National Lakes Assessment, or the NLA. Every 5 years, beginning in 2007, the NLA, our researchers from across the country, the EPA organizes this effort where people go out and they sample over 1,000 lakes across the United States. And the way that these particular lakes are selected for the study It's done in such a stratified, randomized way, meaning that stratified, they select lakes of different surface area or size, and in different places around the country. We can take the results from those 1,000 plus lakes and propagate the results to tens of thousands of lakes across the country. So what you're seeing here is just a map of the United States with our different ecoregions and different colors, and these dots representing different lakes that have been part of the study. So at the time we were working on this project, we had data available to us from 2007 and 2012. And the way aquatic scientists sort of categorize a lake's color is based on two factors. The first is total phosphorus concentration. So how much phosphorus in the system dictates how much algae is there. So that kind of puts us on this blue to green axis. Remember that how much organic matter puts us on this blue to brown axis. So we measure something called true color, which is a colorimetric test that we do in order to assess how much dissolved organic matter is in the water. So when we look at these two variables, true color, measuring how much dissolved organic matter, and total phosphorus, which is an indicator of how much algae is there, we can say whether a lake is blue, green, brown, or murky, with murky being a system that has both high phosphorus and high dissolved organic matter. And this is actually called the nutrient color paradigm or nutrient color status. And it's been around for quite some time. Since the early 1900s is when it was first presented. So the NLA, again, is a great resource because it has both phosphorus and watercolor data or dissolved organic matter data. In addition to having those two factors, researchers, when they go out and sample, they also collect data on the algae or phytoplankton and zooplankton that are living in the system. So we can begin to ask questions about, well, how does watercolor affect how much algae and zooplankton are there and what species are present? Unfortunately, it doesn't do fish. So we can't really talk about how color affects fish from this data set, but I'll address some other things that we've done in just a few minutes to get at that. Now, the NLA data set is awesome, but I do want to point out that it's just kind of a snapshot because each one of these 1,000 lakes is only sampled once during the summer and at one point in the lake too. So again, it's just sort of a snapshot on one day. What are the physical and chemical and biological conditions of that system? And what you see down here, I love this picture in the bottom. This is actually a refrigerator at the water quality lab, the EPA's water quality lab in Oregon. And you can just see the diversity of colors across our lakes, again, across the nation. So what did we find? Well, the data that I'm presenting here are the differences in lake color that we saw between the 2007 and 2012 data set. So if a point falls on this zero line, like green lakes here, that means that we didn't see any difference in the percentage of green lakes between the 2007 data set and the 2012 data set. So green lakes haven't really changed in abundance very much. But what was concerning is that from 2007 to 2012, only 5 years, the percentage of blue lakes, so those really clear lakes, decreased by about 18%. Again, over a very short period, 5 years. So a decrease in blue. We did see a moderate increase in brown lakes, but notice that the error bar crosses this zero line. So it was not statistically significant. But we did see a significant increase in the percentage of murky lakes by about 12%. So again, those murky lakes are lakes that are increasing in both nutrients and organic matter. So in just 5 years, between 2007 and 2012, we saw a shift from fewer blue lakes to more murky lakes in the United States. And the data for 2017 was just recently released. It takes a while to sort of clean it up before it's released to the public. So we're excited to kind of go back to the data set and see what happened over the next 5 years to 2017. So what does this look like across the nation? So here again, we see our map of the US with the different ecoregions, and each one of these dots represents its lake color. Just a couple things, there's a lot going on here, but I just want to point out that notice that a lot of the blue lakes are along our mountain ranges. So high up in the mountains, they have very small watersheds with little organic matter vegetation to contribute nutrients and organic matter. So we see them along the mountains of the Appalachians, as well as out into the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. But when we start to look at the Midwest, where we see lots of agriculture, that's where we see a lot of our green and murky lakes. A lot of the brown lakes are up in New England, which again is not very surprising because we know that we have a lot of wetlands up here. This is referred to as the boreal region. So lots of rich organic matter soils that could contribute to those brown lakes. So there are some differences here in Virginia, close to home. Notice that most of the systems around us are looking pretty murky and green. Okay, when we dove into the biological data, we in fact saw that these murky lakes have more algae measured as chlorophyll here. So they have more algae associated with them compared to the other lake types. And when we further looked at the species composition of those algae, we see that a lot of the algae that's in the system are those cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that can produce those toxins that I was talking to you about. So as lakes shift to this murky status, increased nutrients and organic matter, the probability of having these algal blooms of blue-green or cyanobacteria that are potentially toxic could be increasing. So some highlights of this study is that we found that murky lakes are pretty much the dominant lake type in the United States now, the continental United States. And this was associated with declines in water quality. You know, we see more algae in the system, particularly cyanobacteria that potentially could lead to toxin production that can again make humans sick or other organisms as well. And I don't have a lot of time to present some of the other work, but there are other indicators in the data set that suggest that as a lake shifts to a more murky status, this begins to destabilize the food web. So there's lots of algae at the base of the food web to move up the food chain and support these higher organisms. But the problem is it's not the tasty, yummy kind of algae that these zooplankton want to eat. They also don't really like those cyanobacteria very much. And so what we think is that energy may not be moving as well up the food chain, which can affect higher trophic levels. Unfortunately, we couldn't test that hypothesis because the NLA does not include fish data. So that leads me into this last question that I want to share with you this afternoon. Is my students and I, we wanted to think about this more. Are these changes in color destabilizing aquatic food webs? And we were specifically interested in browning, or how additions of organic matter to the system affect fish feeding behavior. And for our studies, we were specifically interested in baby fish or fish larvae, because when they're tiny like that with small little mouths, they need to eat those zooplankton and maybe even some of that algae. So we wanted to know how browning changes the food web dynamics and could influence these fishes at the top of the food chain. Remember that most fish are visual predators, meaning that they use their eyes to find their prey and help capture it. And so the thought is that as you increase the brown color of the water, you're going to decrease the distance at which a fish can see its prey. So it won't be able to see as well, and it may have to spend more energy looking for its prey to find them. In addition to reductions in overall light, remember that as we add different stuff to the water, it's going to change not only the quantity of light or how much light is there, but the quality of it. What wavelengths of light are present? So in a clear water system, we have good representation throughout the whole visible spectrum. But when we add a bunch of organic matter, we shift the light environment so that light doesn't penetrate as deeply. And it's also mostly red light. So is this going to have an effect on fish feeding behavior? In 2021, so the beginning of this year, my students and I, so this is Troy, Jessica, Nick, and Jacob, we published a paper presenting some of our results investigating this question. And what we've been doing for the past couple years now are some laboratory experiments where we set up tanks in the lab and we alter the color of the water by adding a commercial product called Superhume. So this is Superhume over here on the left. It looks like syrup, this thick brown syrup almost. It's actually a product that organic farmers use to promote root growth. I don't know how that works, but that's why it's sold. And so what we were able to do is take Superhume and dilute it to different concentrations or add different volumes of it so that we could create a low brown, medium brown, and a high brown environment and see what happens in terms of predator-prey interactions. So in the lab, we had 3 tanks representing those different brown colors. And then we had a 4th treatment where we took lake water from a local system near Longwood University. So this was sort of our base water. And then to that lake water, we added Superhume to increase its color. And at the beginning of the experiment, to each one of these tanks, we added the same amount of algae and the same amount of zooplankton. And we let them grow up for about a month. And we sampled the tanks periodically to see how they were changing over time. So here, what I'm showing you is a plot with, this is our sampling date on the x-axis. So we sampled over 28 days to watch how the algae and the zooplankton developed. And on the y-axis here, this is just for zooplankton. We see numbers of zooplankton per liter of water. And what you can see is that by day 28, we have more zooplankton present in the lake water treatments, so sort of their home water. But as we began to add more and more organic matter to the system through that Superhume product that we added, we see fewer and fewer zooplankton. And we think this happened because when we looked at our tanks, what we saw is that over the course of a month, the brown water affected how much light was in the tank. And that difference in light affected how much algae was present in the tank. And remember that those zooplankton eat algae. And so with less algae in the tank, these moderate and or medium and high brown treatments had less algae, which resulted in less zooplankton. Well, at this point, what we did was we added some baby largemouth bass to the tanks. And this kind of replicates what happens in nature. So normally, as the waters start to warm up in the spring with more sunlight, you get this increase in algae and zooplankton. And then closely followed behind that, fish begin to spawn. And sort of they time their spawning with when zooplankton are most prevalent, which is their primary food source as babies, right? So we're kind of replicating, we gave time for the algae and zooplankton to grow up, and now we're acting like we're the fish are hatching in the system and beginning to prey on them. And not surprisingly, what we found is that the amount of prey in a tank had a big impact on how much the fish were eating, right? So in our brown water treatments, the fish were eating fewer plankton because fewer plankton were available compared to in our treatments of the lake water and our low brown treatment. And on the right-hand side here, I put a picture of two of our fish larvae from the light brown treatment and from the dark brown treatment. And I want to draw your attention to their stomachs. So notice that in the light brown treatment, the baby bass had stomachs that were full of prey and they were doing really well. But notice in the dark brown treatment, their stomachs are actually concave here. They were empty and starving so much that their stomach was beginning to sort of distend, right? And not surprising, I'm not going to show you the data, but this affected growth. So the baby bass grew more so in the light brown and lake water treatments compared to the dark brown treatments. Now, we also did another set of experiments where we said, okay, well, what if we give all the fish the same amount of food in each tank, and we do short-term experiments to test whether the brown color of the water affects how far and how well they can feed. And again, I don't have time to show all the data here, but what we found is that these baby bass are really good at seeing, even under dark water conditions. So it's not the browning that affects them directly. They're still able to find their prey. But what's happening is that it's more of what we refer to as an indirect effect. So as those fresh waters, or even this could happen in coastal waters, but we were studying fresh waters, as they begin to brown in color, this reduces the light transparency in the system. As light transparency is reduced, you have a reduction in the amount of algae that's present in the system. And with less algae in the system, you have less prey that are available to the larval fish. So that's going to affect their growth as well as their survival. We saw more mortality in our darker brown treatments compared to our lighter brown or our lake water treatments. So I hope what you've learned from this talk is that watercolor, it could be natural, the colors that we see, but if we start to look around the watershed and we notice more and more human activity, those changes in water could be a warning sign. And I love this image here. So I used to work in North Carolina, and the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula is very dear to me. So what you're looking at, this is the Outer Banks here, and this is the Albemarle Pamlico. We can see the brown waters of the Alligator River, which is naturally brown, draining coastal swamp. We see the lakes, the coastal lakes of the Albemarle Peninsula. This is Lake Phelps, which is really blue in color. Its neighbors, Pungo and New Lake, are really brown because they're more connected to the swamp. This is Lake Mattamuskeet, which is the largest natural lake in North Carolina, and it's looking pretty green these days, as well as the Albemarle Pamlico Sound. We have this big bloom going on in the Pamlico Sound. These different colors are screaming to us in some cases that something is wrong, particularly in the Albemarle Sound, Albemarle Pamlico Sound, and in Lake Mattamuskeet. So we have to be mindful of these changes in color and what they mean not only for our health, but what they mean for the health of the organisms living in these systems. And so just some parting thoughts. You know, you might be thinking, well, what can I do to help? What can I do? And really, they start with small things. So some things that you could think about are maybe, reducing or completely eliminating lawn fertilizer. I know that everybody likes a nice, fresh green lawn, but as we add nitrogen and phosphorus to our lawns, it could potentially run off into a nearby body of water and cause it to begin to shift in color. We can pick up after our pets, which can also introduce nutrients and organic matter to the system. You could consider, if you live near a body of water, a stream, river, lake, coast. You could plant vegetation to help buffer some of that runoff of nutrients and organic matter to the system. And then, a bigger issue is climate change. That becomes more complex, what you can do. But be mindful of your ecological footprint, in terms of your uses of resources, the waste that you generate, and what impact that is having on our planet. Again, you're only one person, but as we all begin to think about this, 7.8 billion of us, that could have a bigger impact on the system. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll say thank you again for joining me this afternoon. If you want to learn more about the research that my lab is doing, you can check out our website at dinaleech.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Leech. Great presentation. We did have a question. Can you speak kind of generally about how rivers are affected by these same sorts of factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. The same thing is going on in rivers as well, although rivers are moving water, right? So where lakes, nutrients and organic matter are sort of collecting over longer periods of time, in a river, this material runs in and then is transported downstream. So often it will, the flow of the river, if it's a fast flowing or slow flowing river, will affect its color. But we do see these same processes, that rivers are also getting greener, browner, or murkier in color.
And we did have a question. If you could describe what the superhuman product is.
Yeah. So again, it's concentrated humic acids, and it's made from, I'd have to look it up, and I could share, if you reach out to me individually, I could share with you more information, but it's made from like a shale product that they kind of condense down. Basically it looks like brown syrup, and so because it's humic material, it represented a good source of organic matter to replicate brownification for us. There is some debate in the scientific community about whether this is a perfect source to use, right? It's not like the organic matter that comes off from a watershed, right? It's more of a concentrated, sort of more uniform product. And so my lab is working more towards trying to create that, like a leachate from soils or leaf matter, versus using these commercial products.
All right, Dr. Leech, and we had a question. This is actually from Dr. Hoffman, our museum scientist. Are you considering testing the same treatments of water murkiness, but with warmer water, simulating climate change?
Yeah, we have not done that yet, but there are others who have published papers sort of looking at warming and browning or eutrophication, like all three at the same time. And it does show, based on these studies, that that temperature matters too, sort of what outcome in terms of the type and how much algae or zooplankton are present. And so, yes, that would be an interesting aspect to add to the study, and others are already starting to do that.
All right, and I don't see anything else popping up in the chat, so I will go ahead and bring it to a close for today. Please join us next week at noon for Untangling the Web of Behaviors Used in Spider Orb Weaving, presented by Dr. Andrew Gordis, PhD, Assistant Professor of Biology at Johns Hopkins University. So if, like me, you are fascinated by spiders, you will definitely enjoy next week's Lunch Break Science. That will be the last Lunch Break Science of 2021. There's no Lunch Break Science the following week, and we'll pick Lunch Break Science up again on January 5th. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.